It seemed like an ordinary morning as the city bus came to a halt, picking up an elderly woman. She stepped aboard with quiet dignity, her every movement imbued with resolve. She chose a seat near the front, unremarkable yet profound. The air shifted as the driver's sharp voice shattered the calm, ordering her to move to the back. The command wasn't just an exercise of authority, it was a challenge to her resilience. Instead of yielding, she straightened her posture and responded, "I paid my fare. I'll sit where I choose." Her words sparked more than a confrontation. They forced the entire bus to make a choice, to stay silent or to stand for what was right. This isn't just a story about a bus ride, it's a lesson in courage and justice. And so, the story begins. The city bus screeched to a halt, pulling into a busy downtown street. The doors hissed open to welcome the early morning commuters. Among them was Grace Walker, a neatly dressed woman in her mid-70s. Standing tall, her head held high, and her eyes gleaming with quiet determination, she gripped her purse as she boarded the bus, nodding politely at driver Mark Benson. Benson barely glanced at her, his face contorting in annoyance as Grace paid her fare and paused to regain her balance before moving toward the front. "Hurry up," he barked, his voice low and impatient. Grace shot him a brief glance but said nothing, continuing toward an empty seat near the front. She grasped the handrail, steadying herself as the bus began to roll forward, her gaze sweeping over the calm faces of the other passengers. "You can't sit there." Benson's shout shattered the silence. Grace stopped mid-step, slowly turning to face him. "I'm sorry you can't sit there. The front seats aren't for you. You need to sit at the back," Benson yelled, his tone sharp and increasingly hostile. A silence fell over the passengers. A young woman near the window lowered her head, pulling her child closer. An older man shifted uncomfortably, focusing on his newspaper. Grace's expression remained unchanged as she took another steady step forward. "I paid my fare," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'll sit where I want." Benson slammed on the brakes, causing the bus to jerk violently. Passengers grabbed onto the handrails and seats to steady themselves. The driver sprang out of his seat, pointing at Grace. "You don't make the rules here. Do you want to get off? If not, you need to move to the back. Your choice." The whispers of the passengers grew louder, a mix of surprise and unease. A young man sitting in the middle of the bus pulled out his phone, the faint red glow of his camera appearing as he began recording. Grace stood tall, unwavering, facing Benson's furious gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," she said resolutely. Benson's face reddened with anger. "You'll see," he growled, grabbing the radio in the driver's cabin and calling for security. The air in the bus became thick with tension, all eyes now focused on Grace, waiting to see what would happen next. The bus remained still on the crowded street, its engine humming in. The silence. Grace Walker stood firm, her fingers lightly grasping the cold handrail near the front. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, the whispers growing louder as the standoff stretched on. "I'm not saying it again," Mark Benson yelled, stepping out from behind the wheel. His uniform strained across his shoulders, his face flushed with frustration. "Move to the back or I'll make you get off." Grace lifted her head to meet his eyes, her expression serene but resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong. I paid my fare. I'll sit where I want." Benson's hand clenched into a fist. "You think you're special? I'm the one who makes the rules on this bus. I say move, you move." A murmur rippled through the passengers. A young mother nearby shifted uncomfortably, pulling her fussy child onto her lap. An older man in a suit adjusted his tie, his eyes drifting out the window. A teenage girl whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is ridiculous." Grace didn't raise her voice, but her words echoed throughout the bus. "I haven't broken any rules. What you're doing is wrong and you know it." Benson's face twisted with contempt. "You don't have the right to tell me I'm wrong. You're disturbing everyone. Everyone here just wants to get to work." He gestured toward the passengers as though seeking their approval. Most of them remained silent, avoiding his gaze. From the middle of the bus, the young man with headphones dangling from his neck raised his phone again, the faint red glow of the camera illuminating his face. "You're the one disturbing us," he called out. "She just wants to sit." Benson glared at the young man. "Stay out of it, this isn't your business." The young man leaned back, unshaken, continuing to record. The bus jolted slightly as Benson stomped back to his seat, grabbing the radio and making his call. His voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Bus station, this is Route 25. I have a passenger refusing to comply. Requesting security assistance immediately." The passenger's murmurs grew louder. "She hasn't done anything wrong," a woman at the back of the bus murmured, her voice barely audible. "Why does he have to make such a fuss?" Grace turned her gaze to the passengers around her, her eyes scanning the hesitant faces. "This is not just about me," she said, her voice calm yet resolute. "This is about what's right." "Shut up," Benson snapped, cutting her off, his tone sharp. "You'll get off when the security arrives." A young boy sitting with his mother tugged at her sleeve. "Why is the driver yelling at her, Mom?" he asked, whispering but loud enough for others to hear. The mother hurriedly shushed him, glancing nervously at Benson. Grace smiled gently at the boy. "Sometimes people don't like being challenged, especially when they know they're wrong," she said softly. "Don't talk to the driver." Benson's voice grew louder, his frustration mounting with each passing second. The passengers jumped as his voice echoed through the bus. "Don't make this a bigger issue." A man sitting nearby spoke up, his voice calm. "Everyone will see what's happening." Benson glared at him but didn't respond, his jaw clenched. The faint sound of police sirens began to cut through the tense atmosphere, signaling the arrival of security. Grace didn't move. Her calmness was a stark contrast to the chaos that Benson seemed determined to create. The passengers remained silent, their eyes shifting between Grace and the driver. The bus doors hissed open as Benson prepared to greet the security officers. Grace stood firm, her back straight and chin held high. "We'll see what they have to say," she said gently, her words carrying a quiet defiance as the sirens grew louder. The tension in the bus reached its peak, everyone waiting, the unease hanging in the air like an unstoppable wave. The sirens grew louder, shattering the silence inside the bus. Grace Walker remained standing, her hand gently holding onto the cold metal handrail. Benson returned to his driver's seat but kept glancing at her, his face a mixture of disappointment and stubbornness. The passengers whispered among themselves, the heavy tension pressing down on the confined space. A young mother sitting nearby suddenly spoke up, breaking the silence. "Why doesn't she just move?" she muttered under her breath, though loud enough to be heard. "Everyone's going to be late." "It's not worth arguing over," the man sitting next to her added, his tone low and clearly annoyed. Grace slowly turned her head toward them, her gaze calm but unwavering. "Some battles are worth fighting," she replied succinctly, her voice clear but not raised. She stared directly at the young mother before turning back to face the front. The young man with the phone, recording the video, leaned forward. "She's right," he said, his voice rising. "Why was he doing this to her in the first place? What's wrong with sitting in the front?" Benson glared at him, his voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the passengers. "Stay out of it, kid." "Isn't it my business?" the man replied calmly. "You're making it everyone's business by stopping the bus." Some passengers started to shift uncomfortably, sighing. A teenage girl sitting toward the front whispered to the woman next to her, "I can't believe this is happening, it's like something out of history books." "Yeah," the woman replied, her voice soft but tinged with bitterness. "But this isn't history, this is happening right now." Footsteps approached as the sound of the sirens began to fade, signaling the arrival of the traffic security officers. The bus doors hissed open, and two officers stepped inside, their dark uniforms contrasting against the bright sunlight streaming through the windows. Benson stood up abruptly, pointing at Grace, his voice seething with anger. "She finally refused to comply," he said, his tone furious. "Stop holding up the bus and causing trouble." The two officers turned their gaze toward Grace, their expressions calm. One of them spoke. "Ma'am, we've been called because you're refusing to follow the driver's instructions. Can you explain what's going on?" Grace remained steadfast, her voice soft yet resolute. I've paid just like everyone else, she said. He's asking me to move to the back of the bus because of his own prejudice. That's not true, Benson interjected, his voice rising. I told her this is a priority seat, she shouldn't be sitting here. Priority for whom? Grace shot back her gaze. For the elderly? I'm sure I qualify, or is there some other criteria I'm unaware of? The officer fell silent, his expression slightly uneasy. The passengers around them watched, some nodding in agreement with Grace. The young man holding the phone subtly adjusted his screen to include both the officers, Benson, and Grace in the frame. Ma'am, the simplest solution would be to move to another seat, the second officer said, his tone calm. We just want to resolve this quickly. I'm not the one delaying the bus, Grace replied firmly. He is. If I step off now, he'll think he can continue treating people like this, and he'll be right. The teenage girl who had previously whispered now stood up, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. She's right. Why should she move? He's the rude one. Sit down. Benson shouted angrily, his voice cutting through the tension. Do you want me to throw you off too? Enough. The first officer intervened, raising his hand to stop him. We will handle this. The young man with the phone spoke up again, his voice defiant. Everyone's seen what he's doing. This video is going viral tonight. Whispers rippled through the bus. A man in a suit, sitting near the back and having remained silent up until now, finally spoke. Look, this is ridiculous. She hasn't done anything wrong. Just let her sit and we can get going. Benson's face flushed red, his fists clenched in anger. You don't understand, rules are rules, nobody can sit here, he yelled. Or is it just people who look like me? Grace shot back, her voice cutting through the chaos. The bus fell silent, her words like a dagger, hanging in the air. The officers exchanged a look, clearly unsettled. A crowd of pedestrians had started to gather around the bus, curious about the argument. The young man filming turned his camera towards the crowd, capturing the moment they all began to pay attention. We need a decision, the second officer said urgently. Ma'am, are you willing to step off the bus so we can resolve this? Grace stood tall, her gaze unwavering. I haven't done anything wrong, and I will not be treated like this, not today. The officers hesitated, caught between the determined stance of a woman who wasn't backing down and the mounting tension of the driver. Benson shook his head, muttering under his breath as he returned to his seat. The atmosphere inside the bus grew heavy, every passenger tense. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, their whispers blending with the sound of traffic and distant chatter. Grace didn't budge, her calm and dignity speaking volumes, stronger than any argument. She stood as a pillar of strength amid the chaos, refusing to yield to the injustice imposed upon her. The crowd outside continued to grow, their whispers filtering through the crack in the door. Inside, the tension simmered. Grace remained firm, her posture unyielding. The officers exchanged looks, unsure of how to proceed. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, their unease reflected in their glances. One officer sighed and turned back to Benson. Sir, what would you like us to do? She hasn't acted aggressively or threatened anyone, the officer asked, his tone calm. Benson threw up his hands in frustration. She won't follow orders. I can't work with someone like her here, disrupting everything. A young woman seated near the center of the bus spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. You're the one causing the disturbance, not her. Several passengers around her nodded in agreement, murmurs of support filling the air. The teenage girl who had spoken before stood up again, gripping the seat for balance. She's just sitting quietly, what's the problem? Benson's eyes locked onto her, his voice icy. Do you want me to throw you off too? Sit down and don't interfere. The officer raised his hand to stop Benson, his tone resolute yet weary. Let's keep this civil, sir. He turned back to Grace, asking, Ma'am, are you sure you don't want to move? It would make things easier for everyone. Grace never took her eyes off him, her voice calm but unyielding. I haven't done anything wrong. If I move, it will only make it easier for him, not for everyone, and I won't give him that satisfaction. A sharp, jarring sound from a phone cut through the tense atmosphere. The young man holding the phone smiled slightly, raising it up. It seems the video is online already, over 1,000 views in just 3 minutes. Benson's face darkened, his jaw clenched tight, the anger barely contained. You posted this online? He growled, his voice low but full of menace. Definitely, the young man replied, unshaken. People need to see this. You can't treat others like that and think you'll get away with it. A wave of approval rippled through the passengers. Even those who had been silent until now began to murmur in agreement. The man in the suit, seated near the back of the bus, spoke up, his tone calm but sharp. This isn't 1955. She has the right to sit wherever she wants. Benson slammed his fist into the control panel, the sound ringing out sharply, causing the surrounding noise to cease. Enough, he shouted. She needs to get off the bus or we're going nowhere. The two officers stiffened at his attitude, their patience clearly wearing thin. The first officer stepped forward, his expression hardening. Sir, if you continue to escalate the situation, you'll be the one responsible. You called us here to handle this, so let us do our job. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, moving closer to the bus. Some had started raising their phones, recording the scene. A man in a work vest shouted, "What's going on in there? Why isn't the bus moving?" "The driver's racist," someone from the back of the bus called out, and the crowd outside erupted into laughter and applause. The second officer rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the pressure. He turned to Grace, his voice softer but still urging, "Ma'am, I understand your position and I'm not blaming you, but this is escalating by the minute. You sure you want to continue with this?" Grace looked out the window at the growing crowd, their faces filled with curiosity and indignation. Her gaze swept over the passengers, some with sympathy, others with exhaustion. Finally, she looked toward the young man filming, giving a subtle nod. "Yes," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm sure. This isn't about me, it's about what's right." The officer nodded hesitantly, his decision made. "All right, ma'am, we'll stay here until we can resolve this properly." Benson let out a derisive laugh. "You're going to let her get away with this? Unbelievable." The officer turned back to him, his voice sharp. "If you act like that again, I will file a report for misconduct." Benson fell silent, his face flushed with anger, his rage barely held in check. The tension inside the bus thickened with each passing second. Passengers sat stiffly, awaiting what would happen next. Outside, the crowd grew louder, their chants filtering in through the open doors. Grace finally sat down near the front of the bus, her head held high. Her calm resolve radiated strength, a stark contrast to Benson's anxiety. The officers exchanged one last look before stepping outside to handle the situation. The crowd outside only fueled the driver's anger, while the passengers buzzed with nervous energy. The young man with the phone grinned, lowering the device slightly to speak to Grace. "You're a legend, ma'am. This video's going to blow up." Grace smiled faintly in return but said nothing, her gaze still fixed on Benson. The struggle was far from over, but for the first time, it seemed to be tipping in her favor. The officers stepped off the bus, and the weight of the crowd outside intensified the tension inside. The chants grew louder, steady. "Let her sit, echoing through the open doors. Passengers glanced at each other, their anxiety now mixed with curiosity. Grace sat up straight, her eyes locked on the windshield ahead. She could feel Benson's gaze drilling into her through the back of the seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. The young man with the phone raised it once more, turning the camera around to capture the passengers' reactions. "Do you see this?" he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is what it means to stand up. Remember her face, because she's making history right now." Benson turned to glare at the young man, his eyes narrowing. "Turn that off. You're causing just as much trouble as she is," he growled. The young man smiled, unflinching. "Trouble? No, I'm recording. There's a difference." A middle-aged passenger, clutching a worn leather bag, spoke for the first time. "Actually, we should all be recording this. He's treating her like trash for no reason." Benson snapped at her, his anger flaring. "You don't get it. I've been driving this route for years. I know how to handle troublemakers. Troublemakers? The teenage girl stood up, facing him. She's just sitting there. How is that causing trouble? You all want to play heroes? Benson shouted, his voice rising. Fine, but don't come crying when the bus won't move. From the back of the bus, a man in a suit stood up. His expression was calm, but his voice was firm. We've been sitting here too long. If you can't handle this professionally, maybe you shouldn't be driving. Benson's face flushed with anger as he shot a glare at the man. You think you can do my job better? Go ahead, I'm happy to let you try. Maybe I would. It meant treating people like human beings, the man replied, sitting back down as murmurs of agreement spread among the other passengers. Outside, the chants grew louder, mingling with the honking of horns as drivers slowed down to see what was happening. The police officers stood near the door, attempting to manage the growing crowd. A reporter with a camera pushed through the crowd, the red light of the camera casting a glow through the bus's dirty windows. Benson, now clearly losing his composure, grabbed the radio and shouted into it. This is Route 25. The situation's getting worse. There's a crowd outside. We need more officers. The radio crackled with the response. Additional units are on the way. Hold your position. Grace took a deep breath, her calm unwavering. She glanced at the young man still filming and softly spoke. You should pay attention to what's happening outside too, she said quietly. This is bigger than just this bus. He nodded, turning his phone out the window to capture the chants and the faces in the crowd demanding justice. You're right, he said, but you're still the star here. Benson slammed his fist on the dashboard, the noise making. Some passengers jump. Enough, he shouted. I've had it with this circus. Anyone who has a problem with me, get off the bus now. No one moved. The teenage girl crossed her arms, her gaze steady. The man in the suit looked out the window, while the young mother held her child close without saying a word. Even those who had seemed uncertain before were silent now, their quiet unity a clear stand against the driver's fury. Grace slowly turned her head, meeting Benson's gaze. Her voice was soft but resonated throughout the bus. You don't have the right to decide who belongs here. That's not your job. Benson opened his mouth to argue, but stopped, his teeth gritted. His power was slipping away, and he knew it. The chants outside grew louder. The crowd outside surged into a sea of people, their phones and cameras pointed at the bus, capturing every moment. A police officer stepped forward, his face tense with frustration. Driver, he said sharply, we need to de-escalate. The crowd is growing and the media is here. The situation is getting out of control. Benson snorted and waved his hand dismissively. So now it's my fault? Told you guys, get her off the bus. The officer shook his head. No, it's not like that. If we force her off now, we'll have a bigger problem on our hands. The crowd's not on your side. Grace allowed herself a faint smile, a slight curve of her lips, before turning her attention back to the window. Signs had begun to appear in the crowd. One read, Justice for Grace, and another, hastily scrawled on cardboard, simply said, End the hate. Benson slumped in his seat, his face flushed, his expression one of anger and helplessness. Grace remained composed, her calm unwavering. The energy in the bus had shifted. The passengers were no longer just witnesses. They were now witnesses to something far greater than this morning's commute. The officer turned back to Grace, his voice gentler now. Ma'am, we're working on resolving this. Please stay seated. Grace nodded, folding her hands in her lap. I have no intention of standing up, she replied. The police officer stepped back outside, leaving Benson sitting in silence, his anger simmering. The noise from outside had turned into a chorus, with chants demanding justice echoing into the bus. The passengers straightened up. The tension now transformed into a resolute silence. The world was watching, and Grace Walker was at the center of every gaze. A voice from outside crackled through the radio, as the officer attempted to manage the increasingly restless crowd. Inside the bus, the tension was reaching its boiling point. Benson remained stiff, his gaze fixed on Grace, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the steering wheel, each tap growing more forceful. Grace remained composed, her chin held high, her eyes directed toward the sea of people in the distance calling for justice. The chants of, "Let her sit," outside reverberated, shaking the very space inside the bus. "You think you're a hero?" Benson growled, his voice on the verge of breaking. He suddenly stood, the chair creaking under his weight. "No, you're just a troublemaker, making my life more difficult." Grace didn't flinch, her calm only fueled the fire of his rage. "What am I?" she replied evenly, not a hint of tremor in her voice. "A person tired of being oppressed. If you can't handle this, maybe you're in the wrong job." Benson's face flushed red, his words spat out with venom. "Fine, I won't pretend to be nice anymore." He moved toward Grace, the veins on his neck bulging with uncontrollable fury. The passengers gasped, some jumping to their feet. In protest. "What are you doing?" the teen girl yelled, standing in her seat. "You can't do that." "Don't touch her," the young man with the phone shouted, advancing toward Benson with his camera still trained on him. Benson paid no attention to anyone, his eyes locked onto Grace. He leaned over, his large frame blocking out the light from the window. "I told you to get off the bus." Benson roared. "If you won't leave on your own, I'll make you." Grace's expression didn't waver, her posture unwavering. "If you lay a hand on me, you'll regret it," she said coldly. The warning didn't faze him. Benson grabbed her arm and yanked, nearly pulling her from her seat. The passengers erupted in anger, many jumping to their feet. "Stop it," someone yelled. The young man with the phone rushed forward, his phone still recording. "Let her go," he shouted. But Benson used his free hand to shove him back into his seat, sending him staggering. Grace frowned, but didn't scream. Her resolve was unshaken, even as Benson continued to pull her from the chair. "This is assault," she shouted. "You can't break the law, no matter what you think." The bus door swung open violently, and the officers rushed in. "Stop right there," one of them shouted, hand already reaching for his handcuffs. "Driver, let her go." Benson froze, but didn't immediately release his grip. He turned his head to glare at the officers, his eyes a mix of fury and defiance. "She's disrupting my bus." "I'm just doing my job," Benson snarled through gritted teeth. "That's not your job," the officer shot back, stepping forward. "If you don't let her go right now, you'll be handcuffed." Benson hesitated for a moment before finally releasing his hold on Grace's arm. She slowly sat back down, her calm unbroken despite the ordeal. The officer turned to her, concern visible on his face. "Ma'am, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Grace replied, smoothing down her sleeves. Her voice was steady, but her eyes never left Benson. But he was not the only one. A second officer stepped forward, his handcuffs gleaming in the light. "Driver, you're under arrest for assault. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "What?" Benson shouted, his voice echoing through the bus. "You can't be serious. I'm the one in charge here." "Not anymore," the officer responded coldly, grabbing Benson's arm and spinning him around to cuff him. Benson struggled but couldn't break free, the officer's grip tightening. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in court," the officer stated flatly. The passengers exchanged stunned glances, speechless as Benson was led down the aisle. The chants from outside drowned out his screams. "This is outrageous," he bellowed, his neck craned, eyes locked on Grace. "You'll regret this." Finally, Grace spoke up, her tone calm but sharp. "I think the only one who'll regret this is you." The officer escorted Benson outside, where the crowd had gathered. Phones and cameras were flashing nonstop. The reporters outside scrambled to ask questions as Benson was shoved into the waiting police car, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. Inside the bus, the passengers erupted in applause. The teen girl clapped loudly, a broad smile on her face. "Finally, justice," she exclaimed. The young man with the phone turned back to Grace, still recording. "Ma'am, that was amazing. People are going to see this." Grace smiled softly, her usual composure appearing gentler for the first time. "Perhaps. Maybe it will make people reconsider staying silent." The officer who had arrested Benson, approached Grace, speaking directly to her. "Ma'am, we'll ensure everything about this is properly documented. Do you want to press charges against him?" Grace nodded firmly. "Absolutely." The officer tipped his hat in acknowledgement. "We'll handle the rest. You just stay seated here." "Mrs. Walker," the officer continued, his tone respectful, "you've inspired all of us today. That man deserved what he got." Grace nodded again, her expression unwavering. As the officer stepped outside, the crowd erupted into cheers once more. This time, their chants had shifted. They were now calling her name. Grace Walker had become a symbol of resistance, a quiet yet powerful figure standing firm against injustice. The police car carrying Mark Benson sped away from the scene, the siren fading into the distance as it turned the corner. Outside, the crowd roared with applause, their cheers echoing through the crisp air. Inside the bus, the atmosphere had shifted. The passengers, once hesitant and filled with unease, were now buoyed by a sense of relief and triumph. Grace Walker remained seated at the front, her posture as steady as before. She absently brushed her arm where Benson had grabbed her, her hand pausing briefly before resting back in her lap. The young man with the phone approached, still recording. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, the defiance he'd shown toward Benson replaced with genuine concern. "I'm fine," Grace replied, her tone steady. She looked him directly in the eyes, her quiet strength evident in every word. "It takes more than that to shake me." The teenage girl stepped closer, clutching her backpack to her chest, her eyes wide with admiration. "You were amazing," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "I can't believe you stood up to him like that." "It wasn't just for me," Grace responded, her gaze sweeping across the other passengers. "Sometimes, you have to stand up even when it's uncomfortable." Her words resonated, hanging in the air like a solemn reminder. The man in the suit, silent until now, finally spoke. "You have more courage than most, Mrs. Walker." Grace gave him a slight nod, her eyes glinting with quiet determination. The young mother, still holding her child tightly, leaned forward from her seat. "Grace Walker," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she admitted, her tone heavy with guilt. I didn't want to make things worse." Grace offered her a gentle smile. "It's never easy, especially when fear takes hold. But every voice matters. Remember that next time." The young man with the phone interrupted, holding up his screen toward Grace. "Your video's spreading fast," he said. "I just checked, it already has tens of thousands of views. People are sharing it everywhere." Grace raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Is that so?" she said. "It seems the truth always finds its way." Before anyone could respond, the replacement driver, a petite yet commanding woman, stepped onto the bus. She adjusted her cap and scanned the passengers with a sharp but kind expression. "Good morning," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I'll be driving this bus for the rest of the route. Apologies for the delay." Her eyes lingered on Grace, recognition dawning as she gave a respectful nod. "Mrs. Walker, isn't it?" she asked. Grace returned the nod, her response calm. "Yes. I just want to thank you," the driver said. "What you did today wasn't just for you. It was for all of us." The bus fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Grace nodded again, saying nothing, but her gratitude shone clearly in her gaze. The driver turned back to her seat, and the bus roared to life, resuming its journey. As they passed each stop, the passengers began discussing the events that had unfolded. Some questioned how Benson had kept his job for so long, while others voiced anger at a system that had allowed his behavior to persist. Grace listened silently, her presence a steady anchor amidst the waves of conversation. The young man with the phone eventually sat down beside her, lowering his device for the first time. "What happens next?" he asked. Grace turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm pressing charges," she said firmly. "Then we'll see where this fight takes us." He nodded slowly. "I think you'll have a lot of people willing to help. Your video, it's not just about this bus. It's bigger than that." Grace smiled faintly. Change doesn't come from silence. The teenage girl, now seated across from them, leaned forward. Do you think they'll fire him for good? She asked. Grace pressed her lips together briefly before sighing. I don't know, she admitted. But whatever happens to him, I'll make sure everyone knows where he stood. That's what really matters. The bus halted at the next stop, and a few passengers stepped off. Outside, the crowd had thinned, but several people still held signs and chanted. Grace glanced through the window and raised her hand in a gentle but powerful gesture. The remaining onlookers responded with cheers of support. As the bus rolled forward, Grace felt a surge of determination building within her. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, she knew that. But for the first time, it seemed like the once silent voices around her had found their strength. And that, to her, was a true victory. The fallout from the confrontation on the bus spread rapidly. By the next day, Grace Walker's name was everywhere. The video recorded by the young passenger went viral, garnering millions of views on social media. News outlets quickly picked up the story, replaying the footage of Mark Benson yanking Grace from her seat, followed by his subsequent arrest. Public outrage spread like wildfire, sparking protests outside the city's transit authority headquarters, with hashtags like #JusticeForGrace and #TransitRacism trending globally. Through it all, Grace maintained her composure. Sitting in her modest living room, her phone buzzed incessantly with calls, messages, and notifications. Journalists clamored for interviews, while activists flooded her inbox with offers of support. Amid the noise, Grace stayed focused on her next step, holding both Benson and the transit agency accountable. That afternoon, Grace's lawyer, Rachel Davis, arrived at her home. Radiating quiet authority, Rachel was a sharp human rights attorney in her mid-40s who had reached out after seeing the viral video. Now, she spread a stack of documents across Grace's coffee table, her expression a mix of determination and gravity. This case isn't just about one man, Rachel began, pointing to a file labeled Transit Misconduct Complaints. Benson has a record of complaints, racism, verbal abuse, but the transit agency has ignored them. They've protected him. Grace nodded slowly. Then it's not just him we need to hold accountable. It's the system that let him get away with it, she said firmly. Exactly, Rachel agreed, her eyes lighting up with shared resolve. We'll not only sue Benson for assault but also the transit agency for negligence and fostering a culture of discrimination. Grace leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Do you think we can win? She asked. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. With public support, yes. But it won't be easy. The transit agency will fight hard to protect itself. They'll try to discredit you, twist the narrative. Grace pressed her lips together. They can try, she said, her voice resolute. But the truth is out there. People saw what happened. Rachel nodded. And we'll use every piece of evidence we have, the video, witness testimonies, Benson's arrest, all of it to build a solid case. But we'll need you to testify. Grace's eyes burned with determination. I'll do whatever it takes. In the days that followed, Grace and Rachel worked tirelessly to prepare for the legal battle ahead. Witnesses from the bus began to come forward, their statements painting a damning picture of Benson's behavior. The teenage girl who had spoken up during the incident provided a powerful account of what she witnessed. The young man who recorded the video not only shared his footage but also gave his own testimony, emphasizing how Benson's aggression escalated without provocation. Even those who had initially remained silent started speaking out, emboldened by Grace's courage. A middle-aged woman, who had hesitated to intervene during the incident, confessed during a meeting with Rachel, "I've seen him treat others like that before. I always thought it wasn't my place to say anything, but now I see I was wrong." As the trial date approached, the transit agency released a carefully worded statement expressing regret over the incident and promising to review its policies to promote fairness and inclusion. Yet, the statement did little to quell the growing backlash. Activists and community leaders dismissed it as empty rhetoric, demanding concrete actions instead. Meanwhile, Benson's lawyer adopted a defensive strategy, claiming his client had been provoked. Mr. Benson was merely enforcing regulations to maintain order on the bus, the attorney declared during a press conference. This incident has been blown out of proportion by a viral video that doesn't tell the whole story. Grace watched the broadcast with Rachel, her jaw clenched. Enforcing regulations? She repeated incredulously. Do they really think anyone will believe that? Rachel smirked bitterly. They are desperate, and it shows. It's even better for us. The trial day arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with tension. Protesters crowded the courthouse steps, holding signs with slogans like "Justice," "For Grace," and "Accountability Now." Reporters flocked to the entrance, cameras flashing as Grace arrived with Rachel by her side. Grace walked up the steps with her head held high, her composure commanding respect. The crowd erupted in cheers, chanting her name as she passed. Rachel placed a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder. "You've got this," she said. Inside the courtroom, it was standing room only. Benson sat at the defendant's table, his expression a mix of defiance and discomfort. His attorney leaned in, whispering in his ear, but Benson remained stiff and unresponsive. Grace took her place at the plaintiff's table, her hands neatly folded before her. As the judge entered and the session began, Rachel rose to deliver her opening statement. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she addressed the jury. "This case is not merely about an assault on a city bus," Rachel began. "It is about long-standing abuse and racial discrimination that have gone unchecked for far too long. My client, Mrs. Grace Walker, stood up not just for herself but for everyone who has been silenced by injustice. Today, we ask you to hold Mr. Benson and the transit agency accountable for their actions." Grace glanced at the jury, noting their rapt attention. It was just the beginning, but she felt a solid case building. The fight would be long, but the truth was on their side. The courtroom fell silent as the first witness took the stand. A middle-aged woman, who had been seated near the back of the bus that day, spoke hesitantly at first, her hands trembling slightly. Yet her words were clear. "I saw everything," the woman said. "Mrs. Walker just wanted to sit down. She wasn't bothering anyone. It was the driver who started yelling." Rachel nodded, her tone professional but gentle. "How would you describe his tone?" The witness hesitated, glancing briefly toward the defendant's table where Benson sat rigidly. His tone was loud and aggressive, like he wanted to make her feel small. "And do you believe his behavior was reasonable?" Rachel asked. "Absolutely not," the woman replied firmly. "He crossed the line. It was shameful to witness." Rachel offered a faint smile. "Thank you. No further questions." The defense attorney stood, his expression sharp and calculating. Approaching the witness, he adopted an air of mock courtesy. "Ma'am, you mentioned feeling ashamed. Could that shame have clouded your perception of my client's actions?" The woman frowned, clearly caught off guard. "I don't think so." "You don't think so?" he repeated with a tone of mock incredulity. "Is it possible you misinterpreted his tone due to your discomfort?" Rachel stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor," leading the witness. The judge nodded. "Sustained. Move on, counselor." The defense attorney retreated, feigning disappointment. No further questions. The next witness was the teenage girl who had spoken out during the incident. Her youthful energy had been replaced by a nervous determination as she recounted the events. "I saw him grab her," the girl said, her voice slightly shaky. "She didn't do anything to deserve that." Rachel approached, her demeanor warm and encouraging. "You spoke up during the incident, didn't you?" "Yes," the girl replied. "I told him he couldn't treat her like that." "And how did he respond?" "He yelled at me to sit down and mind my own business," she said, her voice growing steadier. "But I couldn't stay quiet. It wasn't right." Rachel nodded approvingly. "You showed great courage that day. Thank you for speaking up." The defense attorney tried to undermine the girl's testimony, focusing on her age and implying she might lack the maturity to understand the situation. Yet, the girl's resolve remained firm, her answers concise and confident. The most compelling moment came when the young man who recorded the video took the stand. In addition to providing the footage, he recounted the escalation of Benson's behavior from his perspective. "He grabbed her," the man said, his tone resolute. "No one provoked him. He just lost control. Rachel played the video for the court. The footage captured every detail: Benson's shouts, the gasps of the passengers, and the murmurs of the crowd outside. As the video concluded, the jurors' faces grew solemn, their expressions reflecting the gravity of what they had witnessed. Rachel turned to the young man. "Why did you decide to record the incident?" "Because I've seen things like this happen before," he said. "People get away with it because no one speaks up. I wanted to make sure it would be different this time." Rachel nodded. "And do you feel it's different this time?" He glanced at Grace, a faint smile breaking across his otherwise serious face. "Yes, Mrs. Walker has made it different." Benson's attorney attempted to undermine the video's credibility, arguing that it might not fully capture the context of the incident. However, the expressions on the jurors' faces made it clear the video had left a profound impression. When Grace took the stand herself, the courtroom fell silent. Grace embodied calmness, her voice steady but underpinned with an unshakable strength as she recounted her experience. "I paid my fare just like everyone else," she said. "I simply wanted to sit down, but the moment I did, he decided I didn't belong there." Rachel's voice was gentle when she asked, "Why didn't you move to the back of the bus when he asked?" Grace paused, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "Because it wasn't about the seat, it was about dignity. If I had moved, I would have been saying his actions were acceptable, and they weren't." The jurors hung on her every word. Even Benson, who had avoided looking at her for most of the trial, couldn't turn away. Rachel stepped closer. "What do you hope to achieve from this lawsuit?" Grace's voice grew stronger. "Accountability, not just for Mr. Benson but for the system that allowed him to behave this way for so long. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no one else has to endure what I did." The courtroom remained silent, Rachel nodding. "No further questions." The defense's cross-examination was sharp but failed to shake Grace's composure. She answered each question calmly, her responses unwavering. When she left the stand, it was clear her testimony had left a lasting impact. The trial was far from over, but Grace had set the tone. The truth had been laid bare, and the fight for justice was well underway. The courtroom buzzed with a tense silence as the defense prepared to present their case. Mark Benson, his expression paler than defiant, was called to the stand. He adjusted his tie nervously and avoided Grace's gaze as he sat down. Benson's attorney began with a series of carefully crafted questions, aiming to frame his client's actions in a more favorable light. "Mr. Benson," the attorney began smoothly, "can you explain your perspective on the events that day?" Benson cleared his throat, his voice shaky but resolute. "I was just doing my job," he said. "The front seats are priority seating. I asked her to move because that's the rule. I didn't mean to cause a scene, I was just enforcing policy." "And when Mrs. Walker refused to move," the attorney continued, "what did you do?" "I gave her the chance," Benson replied, sounding defensive. "I tried to keep things under control, but she wouldn't listen. It caused a scene and I had to act." Rachel Davis narrowed her eyes, jotting down notes. Her turn was coming soon. "Do you believe your actions were reasonable under the circumstances?" the attorney pressed. Benson nodded. "Yes, I was following protocol." The attorney turned to the jury, gesturing toward his client. Mr. Benson was placed in a difficult situation. As a bus driver, his priority is the safety and efficiency of the route. When someone disrupts that, he has to act quickly. Rachel rose from her seat. "Your Honor, objection. Counsel is testifying on behalf of his client." The judge nodded. "Sustained. Counsel, please focus on questions." The defense attorney adjusted quickly. "Mr. Benson, can you categorically state that your actions had nothing to do with Mrs. Walker's race?" Benson stiffened. "Absolutely not. I treat all passengers the same." Rachel approached the stand for her cross-examination, her steps deliberate and commanding. She paused briefly, allowing the courtroom to settle before beginning. "Mr. Benson," she said evenly, "you claim you treat all passengers the same. Is that correct?" "Yes," Benson replied curtly. Rachel nodded, flipping through a file. "Then can you explain why, over the past 5 years, you've received multiple complaints, 5 of which specifically cite racial discrimination? Benson froze. Those complaints were exaggerated. Exaggerated? Rachel repeated, her tone cold. So, you're saying the passengers who accused you of racial bias were lying? I'm not saying that, Benson snapped. I'm saying they blew it out of proportion. Rachel approached the jury with a stack of documents held firmly in her hands. I would like to remind the court that these are official complaints submitted to the Transit Authority, each detailing incidents similar to what happened to Mrs. Walker. Would you like me to read them out? Benson's attorney quickly interjected. Objection, Your Honor. Rachel remained resolute. This directly speaks to Mr. Benson's pattern of behavior and his credibility as a witness. The judge deliberated briefly before nodding. Objection overruled. Proceed. Rachel turned back to Benson. Let's focus on a specific complaint from last year. A passenger reported that you asked them to move to the back of the bus, despite there being plenty of empty seats. Do you recall this incident? No, Benson replied stiffly. Rachel raised an eyebrow. You don't remember, or you don't want to remember? Objection, the defense attorney called out. Sustained, the judge said, but the damage was already done. The jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions growing more skeptical. Rachel stepped closer to the witness stand, her tone sharp. Mr. Benson, isn't it true that the only procedure you enforced that day was your own bias? That's not true, Benson shot back, his voice rising. Rachel locked eyes with him, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his mounting agitation. The video shows you manhandling Mrs. Walker while she sat quietly, posing no threat. Explain to the court how that aligns with the procedure you claim to have followed. Benson faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for words. She wouldn't listen. I lost my temper. Rachel seized the moment. You lost your temper. So, it wasn't about procedure, was it? It was about your inability to handle a passenger who dared to stand up to you. The defense attorney leapt to their feet. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge ruled. Rachel took a step back, her expression unruffled. No further questions, Your Honor. As Benson returned to his seat. His face was pale, the arrogance he had initially displayed now shattered. The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs as the jurors exchanged meaningful glances. The defense attempted to redirect attention by calling a representative from the Transit Authority to the stand. The representative delivered a carefully prepared statement, emphasizing their commitment to fairness and equality. But Rachel was ready. Is it true, she asked during cross-examination, that Mr. Benson underwent sensitivity training after receiving 3 complaints about his misconduct? The representative hesitated. Yes, that is true. And yet, complaints against him continued, didn't they? Rachel pressed, her tone razor-sharp. The representative's shoulders slumped. Yes, they did. Rachel's voice grew even more pointed. So what measures, if any, did the Transit Authority take to address these issues? We followed policy, the representative stammered. We investigated each complaint. Rachel turned to the jury. And yet, Mr. Benson was allowed to continue driving a bus without oversight until his actions were caught on video. Is that what you call accountability? The representative remained silent. The courtroom was heavy with tension as Rachel's words hung in the air. Her cross-examination not only exposed Benson's actions but also highlighted the systemic failures that enabled him. The tide of the trial was shifting, and Grace could feel it as she left the courtroom, Rachel walking beside her. Outside, the crowd erupted into applause. Once again, the truth was emerging, piece by piece, and justice felt closer than ever. The courtroom grew silent as both sides prepared for closing arguments. A palpable tension filled the air, every eye fixed on the attorneys at their tables. Grace Walker sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her composure unshaken despite the tight clasp of her hands in her lap. Rachel Davis rose first, her steps deliberate as she approached the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel began, her voice steady yet resolute. You have heard the evidence, seen the video. This case is not complicated. Mark Benson assaulted Mrs. Grace Walker not because she violated a rule but because she refused to bow to his prejudice. Rachel gestured toward Grace. Mrs. Walker paid her fare, followed all posted regulations, yet she was ridiculed, humiliated, and forced from her seat. Because Mr. Benson believed he could get away with it, that her dignity did not matter. Rachel approached the jury, her gaze sweeping across the members, her voice steady yet charged. With conviction. This case is not just about one bus ride, it's about a system that allowed this behavior to persist unchecked for years. The Public Transit Authority knew about Mr. Benson's history. They were aware of the complaints, yet they chose to do nothing. By ignoring these issues, they became complicit. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in before continuing. But today, you have the power to send a message to Mr. Benson, to the Public Transit Authority, and to the community that this behavior is unacceptable. That no one, regardless of their race, age, or status, deserves to be treated this way. Rachel turned to Grace Walker, her tone softening but losing none of its determination. Mrs. Walker could have stayed silent. She could have let this moment pass, but she chose to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. She chose courage over comfort, and she deserves justice. The courtroom was silent as Rachel returned to her seat. The defense attorney rose, his expression carefully composed, though his tone betrayed the effort to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "my client, Mark Benson, did not act with malice. He was simply enforcing policies designed to maintain order and safety on public transportation. Mrs. Walker's refusal to comply escalated the situation. My client deeply regrets his actions, but they did not stem from bias." His voice faltered slightly, shifting to a tone of pleading. "I ask you to consider the full context of the incident and understand that Mr. Benson is not a bad man, just a man who made a mistake under tense circumstances." The defense attorney returned to his seat quickly, his argument clearly lacking the passion and resolve of Rachel's. The jury deliberated for hours, their tension visible in furrowed brows and hushed discussions. Grace sat patiently at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Rachel remained composed, her calm demeanor belying her intense focus. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom held its collective breath. The foreperson stood, holding a small slip of paper. "In the case of Walker versus Benson and the Public Transit Authority," she began, "we find the defendant, Mark Benson, guilty of assault and misconduct." The words rippled through the courtroom, a surge of emotion washing over everyone present. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, a wave of quiet relief mixed with triumph sweeping over her. The foreperson continued. "We also find the Public Transit Authority liable for failing to address repeated complaints against Mr. Benson." A low murmur spread through the room as the gravity of the verdict settled in. The judge thanked the jury and announced that sentencing would occur in the coming weeks. For now, justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into applause as news of the verdict spread. Protesters held up signs reading, "Justice for Grace," and "Accountability Now," their voices echoing across the courthouse steps. Grace stepped into the sunlight, flanked by Rachel and a small group of supporters. Reporters swarmed her, microphones and cameras jostling for position. "Mrs. Walker, how do you feel about the verdict?" one shouted. Grace paused, her voice calm yet brimming with emotion. "I feel grateful," she said. "Not just for myself, but for everyone who stood beside me. This isn't just my victory, it's ours. It shows that standing up for what's right can make a difference." Rachel stepped forward to add her voice. "This case sends a clear message. No one is above the law, and no one should endure discrimination. Today, justice prevailed, but the work doesn't end here." The crowd's applause grew louder as Grace raised a hand in a modest wave. She knew this moment was bigger than her. It was about the movement she had ignited. In the weeks that followed, the Public Transit Authority announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training for all employees and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to address misconduct. Mark Benson was sentenced to community service and mandatory anger management classes, effectively ending his career as a bus driver. Grace returned to her quiet life, though she frequently became the face of community events and discussions about systemic change. She spoke at schools, community centers, and public forums, her story becoming a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for justice. One evening, as Grace sat on her porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "We did it. Thank you for trusting me." A soft smile spread across Grace's face, her heart swelling with emotion. The battle had been long and arduous, but every moment had been worth it. She had stood her ground, and the world was a little brighter because of it. This story is a poignant reminder of the power of courage and perseverance in standing up for what is right. Have you ever faced a challenge where you had to decide to take a stand, no matter how daunting the odds? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could inspire others and spark positive change in the community around you. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family to help spread the message of justice and bravery. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.